The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
I just love doing that. It's the only thing that works. I've actually done it in an airport, and it actually works. You get 3 people to say, out of frustration. Welcome tonight. I want to introduce our guests. We have Dr. Valerie Morkevičius. Look at, I did that so well. An associate professor of political science at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. Her work focuses on the intersection between strategy and ethics and the applicability of traditional just war thinking to contemporary challenges. She's the author of Realist Ethics. There are copies in the back, and they are $35 each. There's an envelope. You can leave it on the center of your table. I highly recommend this book. I've read it. Dr. Yarchin has also read it. We want you to feel free to grab one. Her most recent research explores the ethical implications of disinformation and artificial intelligence, something very dear to me. A University of Chicago Ph.D., Valerie was a research fellow at the U.S. Naval Academy's Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership during the 2010 academic year. And she gives talks on ethics of war around the world, including at military service academies in Australia and the United States. So welcome, Valerie.
Thank you.
And of course, our very own Dr. Bill Yarchin, but for people that don't know him, he's been at the Azusa Pacific Facility faculty member since 1993 and teaches courses in biblical exegesis and interpretation. Bill's scholarly interests revolve around the intersection of science and religion and the history of biblical interpretation. Lecturing on these topics have taken him to Canada, Israel, and Sicily. A member of the Society of Biblical Literature and the Catholic Biblical Association also. Dr. Yarchin published a book on the history of biblical interpretation. Prior to teaching at APU, Dr. Yarchin served as director of the Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center in Claremont, California. Thank you for being here, Bill. And of course, I'm your host tonight, Reverend Cindy Voorhees, and let's get started. This is obviously a big topic, and you're all here, so thank you. I'm going to open up Dr. Yarchin. We wanted to cover some history first and some background, and you said you would be willing to do that. So.
Right. Thank you very much. The discussion of just war theory formally is a development that is post-biblical largely. But that's not as though the preceding centuries, we would call them the biblical years, are irrelevant to the development of just war theory. So I thought I would give you a little bit of a crash course in some basic concepts that were operative in the, let's call it the world of the Bible. So this will start with the ancient Near East in general. In the ancient Near East, all war between, let's call them states. I'm not comfortable with that word state, but I'm going to use it anyway. This city-state versus that city-state and so forth. All war in the ancient Near East was what we would call holy war. And by that I mean it was not simply a matter of a conflict between human armies, but it also reflects the involvement and the participation of divine armies, or at least conflicts among the gods. I cannot overemphasize this. This is huge. In the ancient Near East, divine conflict was how the world came into being, because the world came into being by the defeat, the military, the violent conquest of chaos, whether that chaos be in the form of a god of the sea or the god of the rivers. In some way, there is a chaos that threatens order. And a deity rises to the occasion, I'm just compacting a lot of different stories, and defeats chaos, and that establishes order. Now, these stories always lead from what I've just described as cosmogony, the world is created, to the stories lines lead to the creation of the proper worship of that triumphant deity. Okay, the common plot motif for most of these stories is what we call the combat myth plot, the combat myth motifs, and I've just described it to you, where you have a combat. Okay, so you get the idea. They took this very seriously. What? The threat of anarchy, that would be the political way of saying chaos, or just the threat of cosmic chaos and the establishment of order through violence which is always not just divinely sanctioned, but divinely acted, you see. So the triumph of this king over that king is a reflection of the triumph of this good God against the chaos God, and that's how order is established. And order is maintained by maintaining the worship of that deity, which restores the order annually in that particular society. This was ubiquitous, and that's the background that was assumed by everyone in biblical times. So far, so good? Okay, so now we have the story of Israel inserted into that larger conceptual background, if you will. Indeed, Yahweh, the name of God in the Old Testament, Yahweh is an ish milchama is the Hebrew word, a man of war. You have, and I've got to be careful here too. The Old Testament is not a monolithic thing. It says a lot of different things about this subject. So I'm just giving you a quick overview. Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh commands God's people to invade other countries and even to slaughter their citizens, every man, woman, and child, even property and pets and livestock in some cases. This was understood in the ancient world. It's very odd to us. In the ancient world, this is understood as an act of worship. You devote some of what or all of what you conquer, and you offer it up to God. And Yahweh endorses this. Yahweh fights earthly battles for Israel. This is exclusively, by the way, this is largely when Israel is a political state. For Israel to be a political state or to even be a nation, they have to have land. And this is fundamentally why it happens. You acquire land, you defend land, and here we go with a military option for, if you will, God's people. At the same time, so while Yahweh uses the ambitions of political states, which involves war, for God's own purposes, and those purposes are largely to teach his people obedience. So Israel, in a land under David, under Hezekiah, under Josiah, his kings, is threatened by another power, and Yahweh uses, through the prophets, tells them, this other nation coming against you, God is using that to teach you obedience. It's the result of your disobedience. So you're getting a sense that Yahweh does not forbid violence. Yahweh is actually an agent of violence or an authorizer of violence. And we're talking about war in all this. There's another major thread in the Old Testament, and that is where Yahweh does act on behalf of the people for the sake of justice. And the great story of the Exodus is all about that. The people of Israel are suffering injustice in Egypt, and God himself acts. Now, this is important. God himself acts, and the people of Israel do not. You get that? God himself, the man of war, acts and brings the Israelites out of Egypt. Same time, however, in other parts of the Old Testament, God makes it clear through the prophets that although God may use these nations who are acting in their own interests for purposes that God has with Israel in the covenant, there's also judgment upon those other nations in the form of yet other nations conquering them. So Assyria takes Israel. Good? And Yahweh through the prophet says, Assyria, colonial conquest is one thing. Okay. But decimation is too much. And you're going to be judged. Your turn is coming because of the excess of your violence. This is a key theme in many judgment passages of the Old Testament. The excess of violence, which we could just translate into injustice. So you have a justice-injustice issue, which seems to demarcate what we would call just war or justified war and unjustified war. It's the extent of violence. So to the extent that you're going to find any kind of justification or basis for just war theory in the Old Testament, that's pretty much it. In the intertestamental period, Israel suffers defeat and stays in the subjugation of imperial powers from then on, with minor exceptions. So Israel is now in a new situation where their identity is not so much directly tied to a particular land which needs to be defended by violence, as it is to a law and a covenant which is irrespective of location. When I say intertestamental, I just mean between the Old Testament and the New Testament. largely overlooked by Christians, is huge. Because during this, remember, Israel is now subjugated under imperial power. So the defense against invaders is not their problem. That's Persia's problem. That's Greece's problem. That's Rome's problem. But there arose in this period a form of thinking about God's relationship to mundane history, and that's what we call apocalypticism. And that's this view that, history is just a wash. There will come a time when God will act decisively and defeat all the pagan nations, and Israel, the good guys who are under the thumb of the bad guys who are on top, that will be reversed. That is the eschaton, that is the deliverance that God will bring, typically involving a Messiah figure. That apocalyptic notion where God's people are faithful to God, but they are not taking up arms because that is the angelic army, that is the divine army that at the end of the world will set things right. That is the mindset for many Jews when Jesus arrives on the scene. So Jesus is teaching in an apocalyptically minded Judaism. There are other Judaisms as well, but he's friendly to that. Jesus, I'm almost done. Jesus redefines radically some key components of everything I've just reviewed. For example, the deliverance figure that God's going to use at the end of time to set things right, the Messiah. He redefines the Messiah into a non-violent figure who does God's will and achieves God's purposes, but absolutely not by inflicting violence, but by absorbing it. That, as you can see, is a radical reversal of expectations. He also redefines what it means to be Israel, and it's along the same lines. It is not an Israel that takes up arms. It is an Israel that basically follows Jesus himself in the same pattern as it pertains to violence. And he explicitly instructs his followers to do that. Blessed are the peacemakers, turning the other cheek, and so forth and so on. Okay, so we get through the New Testament era and we finally get into the first few centuries of the Christian church. And for the most part, I'm speaking very broadly in broad terms, for the most part, the Christian church followed that. They are not a national landed people. Their identity does not reside in a particular nationalism. It resides in following Jesus. That becomes the primary denotation of who a person is and who this community is. It does not wield power. And so for the first several centuries of the Christian church, it was very unusual for a Christian to fight in wars. This is debated. But for the most part, the Christian church did not endorse violence because they understood themselves to be following Jesus in this respect. Things changed, to say the least, when the Roman Empire decided to sponsor Christianity. And so suddenly, by the end of the 4th century, the Christian church now is equipped with the instruments of the empire and has to pay attention to questions like, what about foreign aggression? What about taxation? And then you weave in theological entities, which was done deliberately to shore up the Roman Empire, so that the Christian church enters into the early Middle Ages basically a state, or a state entity. And shall we say, finds it necessary to give deliberate, systematic thought to, okay, we seem to have to conduct war. How do we do that consistent with Christian values? And that's where just war theory in the West started to emerge as a formal discipline, and great books are written about that. That's kind of a background.
Thanks, Bill. We were talking to Valerie last week, and what we thought we would do is have Valerie give kind of like the 3 things that you're seeing, and take it here from the 4th century to now. Would you mind covering about, 1,600 years?
Sure, no
and
problem.
You have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, got it. Actually, though, I am going to set a timer because I have the worst professor's habit, which is when I start talking about something I'm interested in, I have a really hard time stopping. So this will go off and tell me to quit. Okay, so we're in the 4th century. And speaking of great books, there's this guy who we now know as St. Augustine, who's going to write a huge text about war and government and the relationship between earthly power and heavenly power. And Augustine is worth talking about for just a minute because he is the most interesting character. So if you haven't read about him now, you have your summer reading assignment. So Augustine's father was a Roman and wants his son to be a lawyer. So Augustine gets the best Roman, by which I mean pagan, education money can buy in North Africa. And his mother is a Christian. She becomes a saint, right? Saint Monica. So presumably she has other ideas for her son. So Augustine is living the life of a young Roman gentleman in North Africa. And I won't go too much into it, but he's really into living a good and comfortable life, right? He's not interested in his mother's Christianity. So he heads to Milan in northern Italy, where his plan is to study rhetoric, because a good lawyer, why do you become a lawyer? Because you want to be in politics, right? To be good in politics, you need to know rhetoric. So he goes there to study rhetoric, and there's this really amazing Catholic bishop, Ambrose, who also becomes a saint, who is sort of rumored to be the best living rhetorician. So he's Catholic, he's Christian, right? That's maybe not exactly what Augustine is there for, but he goes for the rhetoric lessons that you can get by attending services and seeing how does Ambrose preach. Well, apparently Ambrose is really good because he converts Augustine, who then becomes Christian and learns a lot about rhetoric and writing. And he ends up going on to become an archbishop. But in this text, he's living in this moment in time where his story is in some ways not unique. The whole Roman Empire is going through the same kind of conversion that he's going through. So just 50 years prior, Christians did not serve in government. They did not, well, we're not actually sure if they served in the military. So I have several footnotes about it in the book, right? Where just because they say they don't serve doesn't mean they aren't there. It just means no one's commenting about whether they're there or not. And then early Roman Christian emperors try to date back the presence of Christians in the military for political reasons, right? To show that God was really powerful, and at those battles that we won that are really important, that are sort of like in your grandparents' memory, those had Christian elements in them, right? That's why we won. So, don't worry, we're not giving up on Roman war gods and facing loss and destruction because of that. So in Augustine's own life, Christians have just come to power after having been told for 300 years that you cannot serve in government. One argument is because the New Testament's stories about pacifism and Rome being a violent state. But the other issue is any service in government, from being a teacher on up to serving in the military, involved conducting sacrifices to Roman gods. It was part and parcel of the job. It was a requirement. So scholars like Origen or Tertullian, these early Christian fathers of the church, are saying you can't do that. You can't serve in public life because anything you do in public life will taint you because you have to participate in these ceremonies. So don't think that you can do both. So now Augustine has this problem. The state has become Christian, which means, right, there's huge numbers of Christians serving in politics, huge numbers of Christians serving in the military, and they're saying, what do we do? How do we balance these things? So Augustine's response is to look back to pagan Romans like Cicero for some guidance, thinking about what Cicero had to say about the justice of war, and also turning to the Old Testament and thinking through some of what the Old Testament was telling about war. So he develops a very, very thin framework for thinking about ethics. So people who read Augustine looking for just war, you have to read through 500 to 800 pages, and there's maybe 15 pages in total that are actually about war. So we call him the father of just war theory because he's doing this very impressive thing, but he's not the one who systematizes the thinking. He's mostly interested in making the argument that it's okay to serve in politics and in the church. And one way that he does it, to sort of bring in Bill's comments about the New Testament, is to say, think about those passages in the New Testament where Jesus meets with various centurions, right, who ask for their daughter to be healed, who ask, what do I have to do to go to heaven? And he never says, by the way, if you want to be a really good person, you should quit, right? And so Augustine says, maybe that's interesting, right? If he's not saying that you have to quit, then maybe there's nothing wrong with serving. Maybe we've misunderstood what was happening. So, right, this sort of starts a framework for thinking about ethics. In the 13th century, and my 5 minutes are already up, so I'll go faster, I promise. Okay, so several centuries go by. Let's talk about the 13th century. So now we have Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is also not the first of his time. There's several little scholars in between who are very important but rather dull. Aquinas is writing a really interesting text where he's trying to write for local parish priests to explain to them what they should counsel soldiers and government leaders, kings, princes, who are coming to them to ask, I am thinking about going to war with my neighbor. Is that an okay thing to do? Right? Because he's a member of a new order, a Franciscan order, and he's trying to think about what do we say. So the argument that Aquinas is going to make is there's some questions you have to ask yourself before you go to war. So when we talk about the just war tradition, we're really thinking about Aquinas' set of questions and how they apply even now. So sometimes we talk about just war theory. You hear lots of people doing that. I want us to move away from using that word theory, because theories, if we have them in math and science, right, they tell you the right answer. Right? If you have a theorem and you plug in the right numbers in the right spot and you have a good calculator, and my parents are math professors, so if you're smarter than me, right, you get the right answer if you plug in the right variables. And the just war tradition is not like that. It doesn't give you answers. It gives you questions to think about so that you can come up with your own answer. So Aquinas thought you should think about a few things. One is, do you have a just cause for going to war? Is this a reason that is sufficiently grave? And is it a reason that is justifiable? So for him, a just war is one that is about either self-defense or righting wrongs. Righting wrongs is a huge category. There are a lot of wrongs in the world, right? And if we thought we could solve all of them by going to war, the world would be even more violent than it already is. So, Aquinas says, you should think about proportionality. Here's the wrong you see in the world. Here's the amount of violence you're going to have to do to fix that wrong. Are they in proportion to each other? Because if the harms that you'll have to do, killing, destruction, violence, and also think about the harms that war does to soldiers who fight, right? Not just that they might die, but thinking about moral injury, right? And how people who leave war leave changed, right? They don't come home the same person they were before because of the things they have to see and have to do. So Aquinas says you have to sum up all of that, both what you're doing to other people and what's happening to yourself, and think about whether it's proportional. You have to think about your intent. So we can always have a just cause, but is that really why you're going to war? Or do you have some back reasons? Yes, this dude is really bad and I want to rescue his people from injustice, but also, right, I have a personal grudge against him because he looked at me the wrong way at a joust, right? So you have to separate out what your intentions are and only fight with the right intentions. You should also, Aquinas asks you to think about is, can you fight in the way of peace? So fighting for the sake of peace, with peace being the end. Which fits with kind of some things that Augustine had said earlier, that war can be an expression of love in the way that for Augustine, corporal punishment of children was an expression of love. So in the 21st century, whatever century we're in now, we're like, oh no, Augustine, what are you saying? But he tries to talk about how parents who love their children, right, discipline their children. And therefore, neighbors who love each other need to discipline each other. And that might involve the use of force, depending on the nature of the wrongs that someone else is carrying out. And then the last question that Aquinas brings up is this issue of whether it's really last resort or not. Because you should try to find other ways of resolving your problem before you get to the level of war. And that's where things get interesting, because in the contemporary Christian tradition, beyond the just war tradition, we have two other ways of thinking about the world in Christianity, right? We can be pacifists. We can also think about the just peace tradition, which is emerging in lots of mainstream Protestant denominations, including United Church of Christ. And the just peace tradition sort of speaks to the just war tradition by saying, you know that last resort category? You never think about that until you're about to go to war. And then you date back and you say, well, I did this, and I had this diplomatic conference, right? And I tried to solve the problem this way, and I did sanctions, right? And it didn't work. And so they say, well, what about your whole foreign policy up to that point? Were you trying, like, really in your foreign policy to make peace? And then this thing happened, right? Pacifism also intersects in interesting ways with the current tradition of just war thinking as well, because really committed pacifist traditions are not passive. They're nonviolent, which might be a better way of thinking about things. So a nonviolent response sort of picks up on the just war concern about justice and says, you're right, we should care about justice, and we should not stand by silently when there is evil in the world. But maybe we can absorb evil by standing between those who want to do evil and the people they mean to harm. And we can do that in peaceful ways, right? We can physically place ourselves between bulldozers and Palestinian homes and break up conflicts in that way. So, right, the just war tradition should prompt even people who say, I think war can be used at certain times, to ask themselves, is it really the right time? Right? And that's why I think just peace and pacifism are really important for us to keep thinking about, even if we end up being just war thinkers, because to keep us serious about what we're doing, we have to really ask, right, are we getting it right on those questions, which was 10 minutes. And I didn't get to the 3 issues.
I think we need the background. So when we talked about these 3 issues at play, we'll fast forward to 2022 now. Can we do that? Okay. Because I think most of us are anxious to talk about what's going on in the world right now. And the 3 of us talked about what is, kind of the background to what's going on in Ukraine, the view of how U.S. is being a leader with NATO and whatnot. But there's generally a lack of knowledge. There's a lack of history. And I think a lot of us are scrambling to read what we can about Ukraine and Russia. And so why don't we talk about that? And then I'd like to, the second part of this, how technology is influencing this war, which is fascinating, actually. And lastly, it's actually the historic facts about what's going on in light of today. So one of you would like to take it away with that.
I don't have much knowledge about this.
Okay. So I'll be shorter.
Promise.
So maybe, as somebody who's been working on just war since I did my dissertation I think I finished in 2008. The reason I started doing this work is because I was curious about how my professors, some of whom were realists, people like John Mearsheimer, who you might have seen on TV, or if you follow Twitter and political conversations on Twitter, I should probably not confess that he's one of my dissertation advisors. So the realists at the time of the Iraq War were saying this is not a great idea. And my just war professor in the divinity school was saying, actually, this is a really important just war. And I thought, that's perplexing. So that's how I got into this. So thinking about Ukraine, something that I've noticed is that on the edges of both the left and the right, there are concerns about the justice question of the war and whether Ukraine has a just cause for defending itself and whether the United States has a just cause for becoming involved, right, through sending aid and military support. I think some of the reasons that these questions emerge have to do with the last 20 years of American history. So we've had 20 years of participation in 2 wars that many Americans feel really uncomfortable about, regardless of how they felt about how they started. the fact that they went on for 20 years, the fact that we know they caused so much civilian suffering, the fact that at the end there doesn't seem to have been a lot to show for it, makes many people feel nervous about a war that sounds really good when the people in government talk about it, because 20 years ago, lots of things sounded really good too, right? So what do we make of them now? So I think that's some of our nervousness. So from a just war perspective, something that I think is useful for us to talk about is the history of how things got to be where they are, because thinking about just cause requires really looking back and saying, how did things get to be where they are? And in this case, the sort of short story issue is that in the US, and this is true also in Western Europe, by the way, so it's not just an American thing. Western Europeans, my family is Lithuanian, my in-laws are all there. Eastern Europeans are like, we told you so. Living next door to a state with imperial ambitions can be scary. And Western Europeans since 1991 have been saying, well, you know, there's no more communism, there's no more Soviet Union, the world is better now, right? The problem is that the history of how the Soviet Union broke apart, but even Russian imperial history before that, has left Ukraine as kind of an incomplete nation-building project in two senses. One is that Ukraine existed as an independent state before anything that we would now call Russia existed as an independent state. It's actually an older state. But, right, by the 17th century, it's become part of the Russian Empire, which, because of orthodoxy, looks on Ukraine as sort of the heart and soul of Russia, which is a little weird, right? It's a little bit like if you read an American literature textbook, you would think that, you know, England is the heart and soul of English language literature. And so if we were to sort of look back at England and say, well, since the heart and soul of English-speaking culture is London, London should be part of the United States, right? And there's actually a moment in time when this happens. There's a really lovely book by a professor at Harvard, Serhiy Plokhy, called Ukraine, the Gates of Europe, where he talks about the moment, the exact moment when this way of thinking enters Russian imperial politics, which is in the 17th century. There's a group of Russian scholars in a monastery in southern Russia, and they're writing a history of Russia for the Tsar. So when you're writing for the Tsar, it's like writing for the emperor, right? You have to say the right things. You want to, Machiavelli had the same problem too, right? What did Machiavelli really think? Who knows? He didn't want to go to jail, right? Which happened anyway. So these guys are writing a really great history, and Ukraine has recently been absorbed into the Russian Empire. So the right thing to say is, Ukraine has always been part of the Russian Empire, right? And you know, we as one Orthodox community, the Ukrainians did not convert us. We were always Orthodox. Why? Because we are one people, right? The irony is that little historical tidbit ends up getting picked up in every subsequent historical textbook that's been published in the Russian language, right, since then. But it's actually a little piece of misinformation that was inserted at a particular moment of time that we can point to. And we know that it's misinformation because at the time of the peace agreement that sort of gave over Ukrainian sovereignty, they had to have translators already at that time, right, between Ukrainians and Russians. So the idea that this is one people with no history, right, Ukrainians have no history, it's just not true. So that's one example. But our lack of knowledge in the West about Ukrainian and Russian history is part of what makes us susceptible to hearing Russian arguments that say, well, Ukraine is not a real place. This is really Russia's sphere of influence, right? This has always been Russia, so therefore it's no one else's business. Which, as someone who does political science and international relations, I'm also a realist in my other hat. Yeah, that's what great powers say all the time, right? Like the Monroe Doctrine, like this whole continent is ours. No one else should be here. Right? Okay, we've heard that before. But sovereign nations also have rights, right? And the just war tradition asks us to think not about what is good for Russia alone or what is good for the United States alone, but what is really just, which involves thinking about what people in Ukraine want, not just what people outside of Ukraine might want to say about it. So I guess to sort of sum up, right? It's useful to think about the just war tradition, to learn more about it so you know what questions to ask yourself. It's also really important when a conflict happens to learn more about the place where the conflict is happening and the things that go back before that conflict began, so that you can really evaluate in a sensible way whether what's happening is just or unjust.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yes. Good.
I think that covered the three things.
So what we're finding right now is a pretty sophisticated Ukraine with technology. And I think that was underestimated. And by the way, we have a couple of Ukrainians in the room, so you will hear from them at your table. But it's really been fascinating. I love technology, and it's been fascinating to watch how they're communicating with each other on the ground, how the drones are helping. And I think that it's so strange, it's almost like a boomerang to have like a Russian army that seems to be in the 1920s or 40s, and then this sophisticated David and Goliath going on, but the technology is absolutely phenomenally gripping the Russian army. So either one of you want to speak to that? Because I think that is not being talked about enough, that we hear, all the things that we're helping Ukraine with, but the Ukrainians are pretty sophisticated. Does that strike you?
I was struck by the same thing. I would just add, one of the reasons that the whole topic of just war would be woven into this larger topic of the unfolding events in Ukraine, and I think properly so, is this. As the world is watching, a lot of people are just scratching their heads because it is such a blatant pretense. Ukraine did nothing to violate Russian sovereignty in any way whatsoever. And it's almost like a textbook unfolding of, here is how you conquer a neighboring state and make it look like somehow this is justified. You say this, you say, and suddenly you're the victim, by the way. Okay? And that opens up a space for questions like, how is this justified? Okay, which is what professors like you specialize in and so forth. Here's a classic, almost like a laboratory case for, okay, let's unpack just war theory and see what might come here. Another thing that people scratch their heads over is exactly what you're alluding to. And says, gosh, we always thought like the Russian military was, among the world's best. By the way, the Israelis could have set you straight a long time ago. But gosh, that they're not performing as though they are the world's best, and military specialists and so forth unpack a lot of the an aged power. By the way, the leadership is aged as well, and so going on realities that are no longer in place. The steroid example of this is actually World War I, where Balkan states and so forth are beginning to ramp things up, and this is well documented. All the war leaders, all the generals and so forth throughout Europe, their minds are back in the 19th century. They're thinking in terms of 19th century tactics. This is relevant to your question. Even hardware and weapons. And what actually unfolded in World War I was, it's just, it's horrific. The trench warfare, which wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be your old cavalry charges from the 19th century, but the 19th century was left in the past, ushering in a more industrial way of conducting war, which had the result of basically, pardon my imagery here, but just taking human bodies and just grinding them through the gears of that front, year after year after year. I make that analogy with this distant analogy with the Russian presumptions of, we have this, we'll be home by Christmas and so forth. So yeah, there's that.
Yeah, I think one of the things where it's quite surprising and really telling, this past week, There's a Russian TV program on, I think it's on Channel 1 in Russia, with the woman who's the editorial chief of RT, Russia Today. And anyway, I'll leave my editorializing about her aside. But she brought this political scientist from Russia on to talk about Russia's war in Ukraine. And he was really blunt. It's the first time that anyone on that show has said anything that sounds like reality. So I couldn't stop editorializing, I guess. And so what he said is, basically, we're fighting in Ukraine a modern professional army, and Russia's army is not professional. And he said, and they are willing to die to defend their country. And then she tries to be snarky, and she really fails. She says, well, so dying for your country, being willing to die makes you a professional? He's like, no. He's like, what makes you a professional is, right, having this better military organization, which Ukraine has developed since 2014. So in 2014, Ukraine was completely unprepared for Russia's occupation of Crimea and the Donbass. They were not ready. They had no idea it was coming. Their military was not professional. It was not modern. After 2014, two things changed. One is they decided that they had to fix their military problem because they had a neighbor who was going to be aggressive, which was unpredicted. The second thing is they decided they really wanted to join NATO. And what's fascinating is that the desire to join NATO is not really a powerful force in Ukrainian politics until 2014, after the first set of Russian invasions, which is a problem for Russia's argument that this is all about NATO expansion into Ukraine. So before that, there were a few times when Ukrainian leaders would mention, sort of in the same breath as joining the EU, that they were curious about joining. And Ukraine had been admitted to the Eastern Partnership Program of NATO, which basically says, you can practice with us, but no promises on getting in, right? There's no pathway. It's not as though you get on that and you have 10 years. So they've been practicing with NATO forces, and one of the things NATO forces have been working with Ukrainian forces about are things like bringing down the level of command from generals. If you're wondering why all these generals are dying in Russia's war in Ukraine, like that would never happen in an American war, right? So the decision-making power is being divided and brought down to lower level officers who are better able to react and make intelligent decisions based on what they're seeing in front of them, integrating technology so that there's better command and control on the battlefield. And all of this, I mean, it's really impressive that this began in 2014. And that they so surpassed Russia. The other thing we have learned from this is that Russia's modernization process, where Russia has been spending the time since 2001, I think, modernizing their military. So we knew there was a lot of corruption in Russia, but we're now seeing that even extended into military procurements. So some of you have probably seen the images of the fancy modern GPS systems inside the cockpits of Russian planes, where it's cheap Chinese GPS is like you have in your car taped to the cockpit, right? Okay, right. That's not helpful, right? I'm not an expert on military technology, but I think that's not what they paid for. So what we've seen is that that corruption in the political system has had a really negative effect on what's happening. So the technological factor here is both a push and a pull factor. That Russia's own internal corruption undermined their war preparedness, apparently without the political leadership being aware. Whereas Ukraine's war since 2014, since it was invaded by Russia, has brought Ukraine much closer to a modern Western standard of war. So,
crazy. Well, we're going to break into groups in a minute, but my comment, just from a pastoral point of view, is how technology with the smartphone and the video on the ground and the people literally giving us second by second narration of this war. This is going also into our psyche as Americans or all over the world. I don't think any of us have ever seen a war like this where it's in our living room 24/7. And so there's a lot of empathy, there's a lot of overwhelming emotions that I find with people on top of a pandemic, and you've got baby formula, who knew, but we're sick and tired, and then this war comes into our living room. And it's almost like an affront to our democracy. It's always like after the Afghanistan debacle, it's almost like it's too much. So what I thought we would do is, Bill, you've got the questions and your facilitator at the table. I think we need to talk about this as people of faith and just meet your neighbor at your table and discuss it for a few minutes, and we'll walk around and talk with you. But I think it would be helpful to get some of this on paper, and then maybe we can call on you and see what your table felt were important items at your discussion.
Yep.
You want to?
So everybody at a table, you have a facilitator. And by the way, these are guidelines. If the Spirit moves you in your conversation in some other direction, feel free. Whatever questions emerge, the wisdom does not reside up here necessarily.
These are primers.
But our prompt questions are things like, how has this war affected us personally? How can we respond as a faith community here at St. James faithfully about this war? What creative ideas can we come up with on what we can do as Christians? And I'd like to take the opportunity just to underscore that as Christians, because it's my conviction that the Christian witness is an important element that can be infused into the national and even international conversations on this. What can we do as Christians to serve in the light of these kinds of conflicts that we face in the world, particularly in Ukraine? And we shouldn't pretend that this is the last time this sort of thing is going to happen in the 21st century. So it's just a chance for us to share with each other and see what creative ideas and questions we can come up with. Are we good?
Okay, I'm glad you guys are really, I've been to a couple tables and you're really into this. So we have a microphone we're going to pass around, and maybe each facilitator can take a minute and kind of download your discussion at your table, just some highlights. Why don't we start? Do we have a microphone? Oh, well, let's start over here with Walter. Yeah.
Thanks for giving me so much time to collect my thoughts, Cindy.
I'm sorry?
Thank you for giving me so much time to collect my thoughts.
Oh, okay. I knew you could do it.
We have Lydia here.
Lydia's our Ukrainian.
Lydia, who's
resident.
from Ukraine. So
Yay.
we spent a lot of time listening and learning from Lydia. And I'm not going to go through all. I've filled up 5 note cards, but I will say there's an amazing story if somebody wants to interview and talk to her about her family, which is divided between Russia and Ukraine, and the difficulties that has created in her personal life. We started with the question of how much time are you spending watching the news, and some of us said, half an hour a day, and some of us said an hour a day. Lydia's response was that she cannot watch the news because it's too hard, which I think is actually a perfectly rational response. If I was living in Hong Kong watching the invasion of Newport Beach and seeing buildings turned to rubble, I probably would just turn off the TV. One bit that we lingered on a bit is that the US has kind of conveniently forgotten something called the Budapest Memorandum. When the Soviet Union split up and Ukraine had these nuclear weapons, the US and the UK and Russia essentially forced Ukraine to give them up in return for a piece of paper, is Lydia's words. And she is wishing, and I'm sure lots of Ukrainians are wishing, that they'd gotten a lot more than a piece of paper from the US. They'd gotten, say, something akin to the US force in Korea. We also talked about the possibility of the war ending something akin to Korea, in which the US takes a much stronger role, actually the traditional boots on the ground, and then leaves boots on the ground there to defend Ukraine. And who knows, 50 years from now, downtown Kyiv might be the bustling, booming, prosperous place that Seoul is today. There.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share? Rick, you want to? Bob, Rick, over here. Oh, I guess we're going with Mark.
Thank you, Bob. We spoke about what we can do personally and what's happening to us personally. And the answer we got loud and clear is it's causing a lot of anxiety and a lot of emotional disruption in our lives, and not only our lives, but throughout the whole world with what's happening. And that's because of the unknown of why all of this is happening. And that question came up, why? And also we heard the same thing, that people can't listen to the news. It's kind of painful to hear the news, and what do you believe and what is the news telling us, that sort of thing. Some people are disgusted with it, and the hard part of that is personally is that innocent people are being attacked. And here we are here, what can we do about it? And then the other questions, if you want me to go to that, they kind of dovetail into each other, our faith community and what is happening to us as Christians. How do we respond to it? We certainly had a very lively discussion at this table, that's for sure. We can do several things as Christians. Number one is to pray. Number two is to have an evening like this, to invite speakers here and to come forward and raise our consciousness to the things to wonder what is a just war and how are we responding as a world and as a nation and individually, how do we think? Another thing is that some of us are activists and some of us aren't. Do we flee or do we stay and defend ourselves? What do we say? Another big thing is to support humanitarian events and things that are happening, to give money, to join causes, to do that sort of thing. Another big one, make your voices heard. Go out publicly and speak about that. And another thing is to listen, especially if you have children. Listen to the things that they're talking about. Support the organizations that children are a part of and get into the discussion and see how they feel about it. And of course, the bottom line is, and that we've heard it, that God and the message that Jesus proclaimed, we have to always go to the scriptures and hear what the gospel is saying about that and how we are able to respond to that in a just way. Big question came is, what are they really saying about what is just? Did we really get an answer one way or the other? And I think something that we heard, and this is our interpretation, is that we need to go about this with the least amount of aggression and taking lives away that we can, but also to be consciously aware of that we do have to defend ourselves some way or another the best that we can. So that's what our table discussed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Rick Lieberman. First, the young lady that I really enjoyed personally, as did our table, your comments about England and the U.S. and who should be doing what to whom, number one. And number two, as an ex-naval aviator, I enjoyed your point about the Russian jets, about the Chinese cockpits. That's pretty cool. We talked a lot about philosophical ideas here, and we never really reached a single answer per se. And what really got us wrapped around the axle was Bill's point about colonial conquest may be necessary from time to time, but not decimation. And we got into the discussion about when do the curves cross? When does one start and the other end? And when should it start and when should it end? If anybody can figure that out, tell this table right here, because we could not do that. And then I think the takeaway we had ties with yours in terms of recommendations as Christians, what we can do together. Be honest with ourselves. And remember, it's human beings to human beings. Help thy neighbor, which is essentially what you said.
Thank you.
So our table will keep it brief, but we focused on the creative ideas that we can do as Christians to serve in light. And we have been doing, I think, Lydia, correct me if I'm wrong, some pretty good stuff in giving aid in need and Amazon stuff. But what we talked about here is in previous wars, like back when you wrote letters, is there things we can do from an emotional needs perspective as a church to give back to the community, to know that we're there, maybe not in a letter writing campaign, but in a more technologically advanced or 2022 version of that, to know that we as a community support the Ukraine right now? You go. Karen.
Karen, take the mic. Hey, okay, I'll do this little dance. No, what about like in the packages that we send to have a total church St. James put together, like, and it doesn't have to be in English, but it can be pictures like hearts and some kind of encouragement that when the children open the envelopes, or the women that are left behind from their husbands fighting, they feel like an emotional bond to us in a loving sense, that we're not just giving them things to help them survive, but to help them emotionally survive.
Thank you. When Dan and I reached in our closet tonight to wear something, we need to show support in everywhere and every way we can. My name's Ron Grundy, and I really think this evening we were gifted with Valerie right there at our table. What a gift. We didn't get to any topics. We just kept barreling questions at her, and she kept answering them in the most kind and scholastic and intelligent way. I want to thank Reverend Cindy. I want to thank Bill. I want to thank Valerie. I want to thank all of you. We have nowhere to go and talk about these things. Dan and I share each other, but no neighbor wants to talk about it. Our family says we saw it on TV. So this evening is an opportunity to grow and reach and ask and listen and love, which the Lord asked us to do. I leave here a better person than I arrived, because I've learned the mystery of just wars. All of us came here saying there's no such thing as a just war. But we learned in World War II with Hitler there is a just war. And that war may need to be fought again here and now in Ukraine. Our concerns are many. I'm not going to go through what we discussed, but we are worried that the Americans may tire of supporting this. And we're the people in this room to say, do what you can, where you can, when you can. And we are so honored to have this Ukrainian flag on the side of our house of worship. Neighbors see it and respect it. In fact, it would be okay if you put one on your home. I put one out of my closet, but I would love to have a Ukrainian flag. I want those people to know that being attacked for no reason, we have all done that as teenagers. Someone attacked us for no reason. But this is very serious. And I thank you so much for arranging this, what you've done. It's amazing. And we are all better for having been here. Amen.
And I will say, both of you guys look good in yellow and blue.
We'd like to add our thank you to Valerie, Bill, and of course, Reverend Cindy. Lots of good discussion. And Bill, thank you so much for coming When Bill came to the table, it presents us all to what did Jesus do? Jesus looked at this situation, and immediately we went to the spirit of the Ukrainian people, their resilience, their not giving up. What is it they find within them that power that they have? And it's inspiring. And just to bring up a couple other things, one other thing, that when we see other countries, particularly on the border, prompted to go to join NATO, what that means is that people come around a table, and they won't all agree, but they're coming around the table and they're talking. And that is the beauty of this. If we can say if there's some good that's coming out, that's certainly true, just as we have done tonight. So thank you again.
So much has been said already. I think we were just so overwhelmed by all that we've seen in the last few months, and asking, what is it that we can do? You know, our hearts are broken as we see all of these people's hearts being broken, their places destroyed. And what do we do? It's wonderful to hear all of the things that have gone around these tables. But to know that our hearts are available and looking for ways in which we can respond.
And I'll do the same thing, try not to add too much that we've already said. First of all, thank you for the historical, very close to a speaker. Thank you for the historical background on chaos and how that's leading into looking for a deity to save us. And then thank you for the user-friendly version of what's going on in the Ukraine and just war tradition, and to be mindful of not saying just war theory, and to just kind of be more intentional in the way we discuss it. We had a really interesting discussion. We spent a lot of time on the first question. And one of the things that we talked about, aside from being emotionally involved and the lack of sleep and the frustration and anger, was also that Ukraine's a very valuable piece of land, you know, and that it's causing a lot of inflation in our area because it is a breadbasket. And John, who's a history professor at the university level, was reminding us how Hitler had once tried to make Ukraine its own breadbasket. So poor Ukraine has been desired and valued for a long time. Linda, who's a child of war, a self-proclaimed child of war, both of her parents were in war, shared a story that her mother taught when her mother was in Vietnam and talking about the American soldiers. And her mother was in Malay talking about these American soldiers who were young men who had been programmed to do what they thought was right. And that her mother offered sympathy and compassion for these young men who were actually her aggressors. And that brought up the discussion of just humanizing this experience, depoliticizing what's going on, and trying to remember to be human and show our love and to be Christ for others, as Reverend Cindy was saying in the very beginning of your choice to assist and be a part of this experience with Ukraine. So that's it. Thank you. Did you want to say anything? Yes, I'm sorry, we have one more comment.
One of the things I missed, Valerie, you might have done this, but it seems to me one of the key characteristics of just war is to wage war justly and not target civilians. And one of the things that we talked about was the different, if you live in Russia, you're getting one story. If you live here or in Europe, you're getting a totally different story. But it seems to me that the pretty incontrovertible fact is that the Russians are targeting civilians. They are not fighting a just war. And so however they might justify their cause, they're violating just war principles in that way.
I think so much has been said already. We had a great discussion, and we started out with the first question and how it's affected, and we've all talked about it as well. And I really just come to the end of what creative ideas. And we started last Sunday with love your neighbor as yourself. And from here, it's very difficult. We were, monetary, how can we send things over? What can we do? And kind of came around to let that keep fluttering over to Ukraine. Love your neighbors as yourselves, and do what we can to honor the people there. And this is clear as mud as how justified this is. Not knowing all the information, we want to hear what we want to hear. We don't hear what we don't want to hear, and not understanding it all. So this has been huge for me, is getting the history, and I know you did it in, you went over 5 minutes. Thank you very much, because you gave me more than I needed, or not needed, but wanted. And but there's so much more to learn. So I really appreciate this. This is wonderful, and I know we all do, especially here at our table. So thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to do a few more thank you. Thank you, of course, Valerie, for flying all the way over here to California. And she will be with us again Sunday morning, 10 o'clock. And Bill, of course, thank you for always being my go-to theologian. Got to be here. Our sound engineers struggled tonight. Lee, Wyatt, Kent, thank you for being here. They did yeoman's job. Our kitchen crew, Kayla, Araceli, Miguel, thank you. Our bartender, of course, Bartender Bob. And of course, our 9 facilitators tonight. You did a great job. Thank you so much. Excellent. So just go home, drive safe, and good night. Oh, there's food to take, people. There's leftover food if you'd like to take some. Yes.
Am I on? Yeah, I'm on. One topic that came up at our table that I thought was interesting, while our hearts are extremely empathetic for all the people in Ukraine that are suffering, our guess is that there are a fair number of people in Russia that are suffering equally with economic sanctions and whatnot. So somebody asked the question, should we be empathizing and praying for the Russians? And my response was, hell yes. It's not that they didn't choose to do it. So 2 ways.
Okay.